Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Stewart. I'm a journalist of 30 years and I'm the host of the Praxis discussion panel this morning. Thanks for all coming along. Hello to our friends up in Timor-Leste and our friends in PNG who are listening online. Welcome. With me here on the panel today, we have the illustrious Chris Bennett, Senior Transport Specialist based at the World Bank in Sydney. We also have Jon Burrough, who's the Director of the Humanitarian Emergency Response Section at AusAID. And we also have, not lastly but not least, Amalia Fawcett, who is the Senior Advisor Policy and Planning at Plan International. So thanks for all coming today. Today's panel discussion is going to be on natural disasters and international development. Natural disasters, it seems like every few weeks some catastrophe comes out of nowhere. When we least expect it, nightmare images can flash across our screens full of despair and devastation. Haiti, Chile, the tsunami in Samoa. Who will ever forget the image of the Indian Ocean tsunami? Unfortunately, natural disasters happen all around the world and are very common. Terrible bushfires even hit my home state of Victoria recently. My friend's house burnt down. He had about 20 seconds to get out of the place. So they happen all around the world. An alarming fact is that there is twice as many natural disasters in the 1990s than in the 1970s. Of course, many Pacific Island countries are amongst the world's most vulnerable to natural disasters. Since 1950, natural disasters have directly affected more than 3.4 million people and led to more than 1,700 reported deaths in the region. In the 1990s alone, reported natural disasters cost the Pacific Island region US $2.8 billion. The number of hurricane-strength cyclones has increased in the Southwest Pacific in the last 50 years, with an average of 4 events now occurring each year. Particularly for developing countries, it's a lot worse, and disaster losses can exceed 10% of the gross domestic product, the GDP, in disaster years, seriously impacting already fragile economic and social programs. In Fiji, for example, it's in the tropical cyclone belt, and one cyclone on average passes through Fijian waters each year. In PNG, in the past 25 years, there's been a huge death rate caused by earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, wave surges, cyclones, flooding, landslides, and droughts. Timor-Leste is located in an area of high seismic activity and is exposed to earthquakes and to tsunamis. Earthquakes are common and cause localised damage. On the road to Balabo recently, I've seen firsthand up in East Timor earth and huge rocks on the road. Seasonal monsoon rains and strong winds or cyclones affect the country and regularly damage and destroy homes, particularly in rural areas. In the absence of recovery support following a disaster, communities are forced to pick themselves up despite their meagre resources and continue from where the event left them. If there is some good news about the statistics, it is that the number of people affected by natural disasters have increased at a slower rate. Unfortunately for us, it is not what if a natural disaster hits, but when. Disaster risk reduction is so important and would seem the key. How do we cope with all this? Today we have 3 speakers here who have come from all over the place to get here. Thanks a lot for coming. Who we hope will shed light on the better ways to be prepared and respond to such events. First up, we've got Chris Bennett. Chris is a Senior Transport Specialist, Canadian, that's right, and is based in the World Bank Sydney office. Today he will look at what experience has shown us in terms of being able to take actions in advance of the disaster to help mitigate its effects. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks Paul. Yeah. It's a very timely discussion talking about disasters. After all, just last week we had the huge disaster in Europe where all air travel stopped. And it was really interesting because if you start looking at the background of that, you realize that no one had planned for that eventuality. I was reading that it took them 3 days to fit an aircraft with the right sensors to go and measure the particulates in the air. It took them 2 days to have all the transport ministers have an audio conference to decide what to do. Now you contrast that with the US. By the way, I'm Canadian, as you know, and they actually have in place procedures. They have 6 aircraft instrumented, ready to go up in case this happens. Alaska Airlines has computer modeling of potential volcanoes and how they'll reroute their flights. And so, this is a prime example of failure to actually plan for a disaster and be ready for it. Now, a few years ago, the bank published a really good policy note. Those of you who are here in the audience will have seen it outside, which is called Not If But When. And that's the basic issue when it comes to getting ready for natural disasters. We have to recognize they're going to happen. And the question is, when they happen, will we be ready for them or will we not be ready? Now, if you look at the Pacific area, what the bank has found in this report is that there were 15 major cyclones or disasters between 1950 and 2004. And those 15 storms caused almost 80% of the economic damage to the Pacific Islands. So you see, it's not all these regular storms, it's the occasional big one. And I pulled out some interesting statistics that the worst storm ever to hit the United States was in 1926 in Miami. And that storm plus Hurricane Katrina is about 22% of the total economic damage to America in 100 years. So 2 storms, almost 22% of the total economic damage. So we need to recognize that extreme events can happen and do happen, and when they do happen, there'll be a huge impact. What we have found is that, for example, in a typical year when a cyclone hits Samoa or Tonga, over 40% of the people are affected by that. And in the same way that when these storms hit the major cities, be it Apia, be it Nuku'alofa, you can cause damages of up to 100% of GDP. So you can have huge, huge impacts. Now, what we do know is that the frequency of disasters may or may not be increasing. There's a lot of debate among the climate community. But the economic consequences and the social consequences are becoming greater. Why? Because people are living closer to the coast, there may be higher populations, but also they're living in more expensive houses, or you've got the downtown cities which have had major developments. And so therefore the cost when these storms actually hit these places is really, really significant. So what do we do about it? Well, first thing is we have to recognize, as I said before, it's not if but when. And we need to look at how do we manage the risk? How do we manage the fact that there is likely going to be a storm? What's the risk of that? And what are the improvements that we can take in order to reduce those risks and the negative consequences of it? And the reality is that by investing more now, you'll save much, much more in the future. For example, in the US, they found that in Florida, by having stricter building codes, they reduced by 40% the impact of future disasters. It didn't cost them 3 or 4 times as much. And so the key message from this policy paper and of the bank is that let's plan now for these events. Let's plan the infrastructure to be ready for it. Let's help the communities to know how to handle it. So, for example, you have in place contracts for small contractors to come and remove the damage very quickly. You have equipment positioned or bridges positioned in the country. If your bridge gets washed out, you can replace that bridge in a timely manner. So there are many, many steps that we need to be taking. But the key message is, it's not if but when.
How do you predict how big an earthquake is to build a road that's not going to be affected by that?
As the road will be affected, it's impossible to completely engineer out any impact from a road. If you look at the photographs, for example, from Chile, what you'll find is that the bridges survived quite well, but some of the road embankments failed going near the bridges. But again, you can reduce the impact by proper engineering, and then have in place equipment positioned around the country, procedures in place that very quickly you can go and repair the damage to reopen the routes. Because that's what you want to do. You want to provide access. It may not be as good access as you had before, but at least the roads are open or there's a bridge there. And generally speaking, bridges are the bigger problem than roads, because if there's no way across the river, there's no sense in having a road in one piece to get there. If you think of, for example, New Zealand, which that many of you would know, I guess we have a New Zealander here as well, is that it's on the ring of fire. There's lots of earthquakes. We had the major one in Napier in the 1930s, and they positioned temporary Bailey bridges at key locations around the country so they can respond quickly towards that. Yeah, there are ways around this.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Chris. Next up, we've got Jon Burrough. Jon is the Director of the Humanitarian Emergency Response Section at AusAID. I said to Jon before, he must hate getting late phone calls at night because you'd never know what was going to come in his position. And he's going to talk a bit about how Australia conducts itself to emergency response in the region.
Thanks, Paul. Jon. Okay, I just thought I'd run through how Australia approaches humanitarian action and emergency response. it's pretty clear that the scale and impact of natural disasters is increasing. Whether they're more frequent or not, there's a scale issue there. Over 95% of people killed by natural disasters are from developing countries where the poor are the most vulnerable. The Australian government deals with natural disasters in the region and around the globe through its aid program, AusAID. We lead Australia's humanitarian action, and including responses to overseas disasters, whether in the region or around the globe. There are two relevant policy documents. Since you held up one, I'm going to hold one up too. The first one's a humanitarian action policy, which was done in 2005, but it's currently being revised, and we're hoping to launch a new humanitarian action policy in June this year in Canberra. That policy has us protecting lives, alleviating suffering and maintaining human dignity during and in the aftermath of humanitarian crises through rapid and effective humanitarian action, through helping partners and regions to prepare for and respond to disasters, and through strong and responsive leadership and advocacy in humanitarian fora. This is the disaster risk reduction policy that Australia put out last year. This is how we reduce the vulnerability and enhance the resilience of communities to hazards and disasters. And under this policy, what we're trying to do is not mainstream, we're not allowed to say that, but integrate disaster risk reduction policies, concepts through our aid program. And because the aid program is working more and more through government and government services, we also hope to put DRR through government services and throughout national and sub-national levels of developing countries. Again, we're going to provide leadership and advocate for disaster risk reduction around the globe, and we're going to ensure that Australia's policies and programming for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation are coherent and coordinated. When it comes to response, it's not often that Australia responds in person. For most disasters, the Australian government goes through their partners, and we have a large range of partners. Just quickly, first of it starts with the affected state. We can't do anything without a formal request from the affected government. We work with a whole range of United Nations agencies that work in the humanitarian sector. I think you know them all: UNOCHA, UNHCR, UNICEF, WFP, UNFPA, WHO, and the DSS. We work with a lot of NGOs as well, both international NGOs, Australian NGOs, and local NGOs on the ground in developing countries. We work through the Red Cross movement. We also engage with regional bodies, SOPAC in the Pacific, ASEAN, East Asia Summit member countries, APEC, and France, which is Australia, New Zealand and France in the Pacific. We have to work with militaries. The reality is, in Asia especially, militaries are first responders. In the Pacific, not so much, and as it should be in the Pacific, we promote the primacy of civilian-led response to disasters. We also work with other Australian government departments, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Defence, Attorney General's Department, and the AFP, and state and territory responders as well. We work through these partners. They're the ones that are on the ground working. They look to donors to provide support. We provide the sort of support that we hope those organisations need and want. We also have pre-positioned stores of our own in Sydney, Brisbane and Jakarta. These can be mobilised if needed in a disaster and deployed through commercial means or through defence transport options. We've also got arrangements with the Australian Red Cross and Red R Australia for deploying Australian experts into disasters overseas at short notice. If it's a very large-scale disaster, that's when the Australian whole of government mobilisation occurs, and that's usually consists of medical teams from state and territory health departments, and that's from all state and territories. The other most common deployment would be an urban search and rescue team, and those will be from New South Wales or Queensland Fire and Rescue Services. Highly trained individuals. Queensland is accredited, has INSARAG accreditation, and therefore it's welcome in any disaster in the world that's got UN coordination. And New South Wales is going for that accreditation in 2012, and we're assisting them to do that. And looking at the human impact of disasters, we recognise that in addition to the fundamental needs of populations, there are, women and girls and men and boys are affected differently, and that our assistance must be responsive to the specific needs of different members. The key sectors, there are key sectors including sexual and reproductive health, protection, and people living with disabilities that there's work going on, but there's more work needed. Given the situation in the Pacific, there is an expectation that international assistance will come. You know, we find that in most disasters, the affected country will turn and ask for international assistance. And that's why Australia, New Zealand and France have got together and formed the France Agreement, so that when we respond, which we always do, we're very happy to respond, it's done in a coordinated way and addresses those needs, the needs that the government wants. We had a perfect storm, what I call a perfect storm of disasters in October 2009. That was the Samoa Tonga tsunami, the next day the Padang earthquake. While those were going on, the cyclones were going through the Philippines and Mekong countries. So in that week we had requests for international assistance from Samoa, Tonga, Padang, Philippines, Vietnam and Laos. And Australia was the only country in the world that responded to all 6. So we tested our systems that week and we learned a lot of lessons.
It must be so hard to deciding who gets what though. Is it like who decides that?
We decide and we go for it. We try and satisfy the needs along with other donors. Yep. So that's a picture of how Australia approaches humanitarian action, and our intention is to respond when required, respond quickly and save lives hopefully and preserve the dignity of those affected.
Well, thanks for that. Our last speaker is Amalia Fawcett, is that right? Yep. And she's Senior Advisor in Policy and Learning at Plan International Australia. She has focused on children's rights and their protection in disasters for the past 10 years. She's worked for various agencies in child protection in an emergency capacity and has been deployed to disasters in Asia and the Pacific region. Today, she will focus on the role of children in natural disasters and how to best respond to their particular circumstances, acknowledging both their right to protection and their capacity to be involved in the recovery process. Over to you, Amalia.
Thank you. Hi everyone. Today I'm going to focus my presentation on a quote I read in a Plan publication, and now that I wish I'd brought it so I could hold it up, but I don't have it with me. But the quote was, "Children are the most photographed and least listened to survivors of disasters." Well, that's interesting because we know from research and experience that they have an incredible capacity for resilience and also some pretty awesome ideas for their communities in terms of rehabilitation. So today I want to focus on reasons why we should be listening more and assuming less when it comes to children. As already stated, I'm coming from the perspective of child protection in emergencies, which is basically the prevention of exploitation, abuse and neglect, and also has an emotional and psychosocial well-being aspect to it. The latter is the bit that I'm going to focus on today. Basically, I have 2 points. Children have resilience, and they also have rights to participation. So my first point about resilience is basically that in the past we've assumed children are sick after a disaster and need fixing. So we've come in with models based on Western notions of trauma and post-traumatic stress. There's been a lot of academic and sector critiques of this, which I can give references for if requested later. However, during the crises in the Balkans in the early 90s, there was a lot of work done on factors that encourage resilience, as well as after the Indian Ocean tsunami, there was a lot of actual practical work on the ground about that as well. So we know from the studies and from NGO experience that the guidelines needed to be changed. So psychosocial response guidelines now support the notion that communities and children themselves have ways to strengthen their own resilience and support. In the Solomon Islands, I met a teacher who taught a bunch of children who'd just been through the tsunami in 2007, the shake game, which was basically she would yell earthquake and the children would shake until they fell on the ground in fits of giggles, and then they'd all jump up and run for the hills, which was a great way of getting them laughing and acting like children, but also teaching them that if this happens again, run for higher ground is the lesson. It shows also that when given the right support, children can bounce back from a disaster and recover pretty quickly. This is important not only because if we come in with the idea that everyone is traumatised, we'll actually destroy the strength and initiatives that people have got in place, like the Shake Shake game. But it also, we need to recognise that communities are best placed to support their own children. The central message when it comes to children is not to look for illness, but to instead look for strength. Another important thing to note in this area is that grief, fear, and disrupted behaviour are normal reactions to an abnormal event. And the fact that there is grief, fear, and disrupted behaviour does not warrant wholesale trauma counselling or the like. This really needs to be emphasised a lot, and when I'm deployed, I spend a lot of time repeating that sentence to communities and to local NGOs. My second point, and my second story, is about the right to participation and what role children can play. When I was in Pakistan after their earthquake in the Balakot Valley, I met a little girl who was looking after her brother who couldn't walk. Because she was looking after her brother, she was not participating in the child-friendly space activities that were being run in her community. As aid workers, we all thought this was a bad thing, but on reflection, and after I did some reading about it, I realised we actually should have just asked her. Because research shows that children don't always view these adult responsibilities as a burden, but can actually feel very useful to their families in the aftermath of a disaster. This is because resilience is also about how an experience is perceived and understood by the child. There's an interesting paper by a woman called Una Macaulay about youth in Liberia who actually had a lot of extra responsibilities during the war, and when they were asked about this, they said they actually liked it because they were getting more respect from their communities, they were allowed to participate more in decision-making processes, and they basically felt like they had something to plan for and a future to look to. So they had actually identified quite a lot of positive aspects that came from a disaster. I'd like to end on 2 points. Basically, one of the most important things to focus on when you're talking about participation is that you need to look at participation through the lens of the best interests of the child principle, which is within the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Sometimes it's not appropriate for children to participate, and when you're encouraging children to participate in community processes, you need to recognise that there will be times when you need to actually protect the children from that participation. One of the classic examples is a lot of the time in conflict zones, people will start peace education targeting children, but unless something's going on for adults as well, you're actually putting the children in a vulnerable position by asking them to repeat messages of peace when the adults aren't actually repeating them themselves. My second point is that you need to strike a balance between a focus on resilience and the recognition of vulnerability. Our emphasis on children who are coping can stigmatise those children who are not coping. And in every disaster you will have a mix, and there will be some children who aren't coping as well as others. They will need extra assistance, and this is particularly the case in protracted disasters or in a rapid series of disasters. If this is the case and children are not coping, we need to make sure we have some kind of referral mechanism and extra support for these children to deal with this. And therein lies one of the greatest tensions in the child protection and emergency sector from my point of view. How do we ensure we recognise and act on vulnerabilities while also supporting and encouraging a children's own agency for recovery? This is something we are still perfecting in this sector, but we've come a long way since the previous assumptions that everybody is sick and we need to ride in and help them all. The reason being is that we're getting much better at asking children the right questions and actually listening to the answers when they give them to us. With all this in mind, hopefully our sector will be able to ensure the children being photographed are also being listened to just as much as well.
Thanks for that. I would imagine, like, is there a great need to set up a lot of orphanages after these disasters? Like,
it very much depends on context, but most of the time we emphasise community care, because a lot of the time there will be traditional mechanisms for looking after children who have lost their parents. So that would be the first step, and then if those are exhausted, then there will be care facilities set up.
And how would you go about finding that out?
Most NGOs work through local partner organisations or local offices which are staffed by locals. So it would be the local staff that would primarily be a source of information for that, and also let us know what's appropriate to ask in a given situation.
So listening to the locals is very, very important. Right?
Yeah, definitely, because child protection can be quite a sensitive issue, and it definitely needs to take on aspects of the culture and make sure that the protection mechanisms that are set up are culturally appropriate and that they're supporting the cultural protection mechanisms that are in place already. The most important thing when it comes to children's resilience, and we know this from experience and from research, is that they're within their own community and looked after by their own family members if possible. If this isn't possible, then the second step would be to look for a care facility within their own culture. And right at the end of the steps that you take, there can be foreign adoption, but that should never happen for the first 2 years after a disaster if it's a new adoption, because tracing and reunification of families can take up to 2 years.
Okay, well, thanks for that. We'd like to open for questions. Okay, we've got a question here from my friend from Timor-Leste.
I have 3 questions for 3 speakers.
Good.
So first of all, with Chris, can you tell us a little bit, because you're talking about to plan better in order to better respond. In cities or towns or villages that actually in a lowland village or lowland city which is prone to tsunami. So do you think how can we better plan for them in order not to have to be struck by tsunami? And the second questions to the second speaker. You list lots of AusAID partners in terms of responding to the emergencies, I mean natural disaster or conflict or etc. Do you mobilize all of them, or it depends on the nature of the disaster? I mean, because you've long listed them already. Yeah. And to the third speaker, you mentioned about the referral system. Could you explain a little bit what you mean by, I mean, the children? Thank you very much.
Okay, Chris, take it away.
Take it away.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that speaking in a general sense is that with any infrastructure, what you want to know is what is the risk of damage to this infrastructure. So you assess the probability and what will happen. If you take a coastal area, for example, tsunamis or high tides or major storms, do you have redundant infrastructure? Are there roads away from the coastal area you can move into? So you look at the overall situation, say what's the risk, what's their infrastructure look like, and then based upon that, what are our options open to us given the risks? Because sometimes one of the major problems with any coastal area is the main road around the island is often along the coast. And so if you get a major storm coming in or a tsunami or something and that road's gone, then what happens? And this is where you want to look at the opportunities for redundancy in your systems. So there may be another road inland. In some places you want to try and move the people, provide incentives to move them away from the coastal area so they're not living right on the shore. They may be living 200 meters up the hills. And these are all ways of looking, saying, what is the current situation? What are the risks? And given those risks, what are the options to mitigate them? It's not always engineering. I mean, in some places what's happened is that the insurance companies have helped change behavior because they basically are saying to people, if you're living here, it's going to cost so much or we won't insure your houses. And so over time, that changes the incentives for people to live somewhere where, in fact, they will be insured. So it's a combination of summarizing, looking at the risks, what are the options, and what are the incentives to create the right scenario to minimize the impact when it does happen.
Yeah, what we do is look at the needs on the ground. If it's a disaster where we have a program, have a mission and a program, then we seek advice from the program as to who's best placed on the ground to respond to the gaps that are there. If it's a place where we don't have a program, we look to the UN and other organisations to provide us assessments. Sometimes it's a consolidated appeal if you want to wait that long. But usually we know very quickly how we're going to shape our response so that it suits the needs on the ground and supports those organisations that can best respond.
And John, obviously, you know, the countries in the Pacific region, we would take a greater role in sort of recovery programs in those, would we? Yep.
Normally what I'm responsible for is the immediate response, and that's done as quickly as possible, and then the program will take over the reconstruction and, well, early recovery, reconstruction elements And usually they embrace those with the program because we're normally working in education, health and infrastructure anyway.
I mean, if there was a natural disaster in Norway, touch wood, I hope there's not, but like, would you have to get involved with that, or would you respond?
Well, we got
to that?
involved with Haiti and with Chile, and you know, 5 years ago maybe we wouldn't have got so involved, but the way the world is turning now, we do.
And would the rest of the world look to Australia like for advice about the Pacific? Would the Americans ring us and say where we're going to send the money, who we're going to give it to? Would they would ask us?
They do. Normally the Americans ring us when there's a disaster in the Pacific. Yep. We normally are talking every day to the New Zealanders and to the French. And we're all working out the best way to deal with this emergency. And we provide advice to other donors as well.
So Australia takes the leading role, in fact?
Well, no. Under the Friends Agreement, we agree who's going to take the lead role.
Right.
And we took the lead in the latest one, the cyclone in Fiji. We took the lead on that. It's like Cyclone Mitch, I think the New Zealanders took the lead. But it all works very well.
And the third question, yep.
Yeah, in terms of the referral system, basically a psychosocial response will generally be, if you imagine a pyramid, the bottom pyramid being the majority of children will be successfully supported with a general program for all children together. For example, a child-friendly space that has supervised play activities and learning activities. Some children within that group might need more specialised assistance, for example, a child with a pre-existing problem or a child who's been separated from their parents. They may need something that will happen in a smaller group. And then there's another group again that will be possibly in need of some kind of direct one-on-one support. So the idea of a referral mechanism would be that the people that are responsible for that general group will be trained and able to see the children who aren't coping even with that general support, and will be able to refer them to the next step. So sometimes, for example, in Samoa, the Ministry of Health took the lead on psychosocial response, and so the Samoan government already had referral mechanisms to a certain extent, and we were also using local mental health NGOs. So everybody knew who was working in the area and who to refer what sort of case to.
Is there a whole program to bring them a bit of, lightness following this disaster? I know down in Victoria, I went with Circus Oz up to the bushfires, and they showed all the kids up there how to do some circus tricks, and it had a fantastic effect.
There have been cases where clowns have been brought into conflict zones, and as part of the clowns' routine, one in particular was showing anti-personnel mines and how to avoid them and what to do, but the children were laughing because a clown was doing it, but they were still learning. But yeah, the child-friendly space idea is based on supervised and structured play activities, so that the children are still being children because they're playing, but it's in a supervised, safe and structured environment which gives children a feeling of security. And those things in conjunction will help a child start to get back into a routine and feel a little bit more secure and stop being so worried about the disaster. After the Kosovo crisis, there was a clown that went into an area and did some anti-personnel mine skits with children.
Great, I think that's fantastic. Great. We got any other questions, please, from the floor? We've got one question here. Could you introduce yourself and where you're from? Would be fantastic.
I'm Charles Feinstein. I happen to be with the World Bank here in Sydney.
Okay, sorry about that, Charles. How you going?
Question for my aid colleague from AusAID, John. How do we as donors avoid the so-called moral hazard problem? That is, we all want to be seen when a disaster strikes as being responsive, quick, and generous. At the same time, don't we run a risk that governments and societies who bear the brunt of disasters, for example in the Pacific, that they won't be motivated to take the kind of anticipatory measures, for example, that Chris was talking about planning ahead, about hardening infrastructure, basically about being prepared so that the impacts when a disaster strikes are lessened. I mean, if you really want to be perverse, you could say, well, the incentive is to maintain status quo, wait to the relief aid and then the reconstruction aid comes in, and maybe you'll even be better off after the disaster than beforehand. So how do we design programs that avoid that problem?
Yeah, that's a very good point. There's a balance there. You know, we're the Australian government. We reflect the will of the people. And there's never going to be a disaster when the Australian people don't want Australia to respond. And that makes us committed, I'm afraid. on the other side of the ledger, we've got our disaster risk reduction policy now. We believe fervently in it, and we want to do as much work as we can on preparing countries, and that's going to ameliorate the problem over time. Not immediately, but the more preparedness work that gets done, the more hardening, as you say, and the better government systems, national and subnational level, at preparing for and responding to disasters, the less reliance I'll have on international donors. And that's the intention. It's going to take time, but I'm afraid it's as simple as that. We have a lot more work to do.
Can I just add to that? We do a lot of work with civil society, obviously, and building up communities' skills and will to demand things from their own governments. So often we're going into communities that are already asking their governments to fulfill the gaps that the government should be operating on. So it's not just coming from the outside, but the demands are coming from the people and sometimes the children as well.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got a question that's come in from PNG, from George Org at the PNG FM radio station, and he asks a question for the World Bank, Chris, so this is going to be you, mate. Good. How many disasters that have occurred in PNG have the World Bank been involved in?
Unfortunately, I'll have to leave that to Chaz to try and respond to that one.
I've only been in the program here for about 1.5 years, but I know that we've been involved fairly recently. There was the Gazelle Restoration Project that was in the aftermath of a volcanic explosion, and the bank was, I should say, instrumental in working with the provincial and national authorities in mounting quite an effective rehabilitation reconstruction campaign. Also, even more recently, I believe, just about 1.5 years ago, there were devastating cyclones and flooding in Oro province. Mm-hmm. And in connection with a World Bank road rehabilitation reconstruction project, we actually built in a new component. Chris, you would know about this one, I think, which in fairly quick order, working again with the local authorities, able to restore a lot of the roads, and particularly, Chris is right, the bridges are probably the weakest link, the most vulnerable part of the road transport infrastructure. So we also view that as being a successful intervention.
Just back to this previous question, one of the challenges which any donor faces with the local governments is that you're trying to help them develop infrastructure, and you say, all right, now if we spend an extra 10% on doing this, it will help mitigate this potential impact for you. But there's not an unlimited budget, and so they have to take that trade-off by saying, okay, if we, for example, have bridges positioned around the country with rapid response, that's less money for health or less money for education. And so there's not always an easy decision to be made. As we can give advice saying, if in fact you take steps to invest in reducing the likely impact of natural disaster infrastructure, by extension there's less money for other aspects of your programs. And sometimes in some countries the politicians just want to see roads paved because they see that as being a fantastic example making progress. But it may be in actuality that because of the local climate situation, an unpaved road is better because you can restore it quicker in the event of a disaster.
Okay, John, I think this question's coming for you. This is from Timor-Leste. Bon dia to everyone up there. Peter Hanneman from the organisation UNDP. How does AusAID balance the assistance it gives to disaster response and to proactive disaster risk reduction?
I was just talking about that. Yeah, it is a balance. I think as the aid program expands, you'll see a lot more activity on this in the region, including the Pacific. It's such an important area of work, and with the climate change agenda going on at the same time, the opportunities for working on both those things coherently is so good that I'm sure that Australia and other donors are going to keep ramping up their work in that regard. I mean, it would give me great pleasure if for countries to not request assistance and for us not to have maintain our capacity as much as we do. But and I'm sure countries would like that as well. But it's not going to happen quickly, and so we have to keep the balance going for the time being.
Okay, we've got a question up the back here. Thanks.
Thank you. Jack Whelan from the Foundation for Development Cooperation, based in Australia, but with activities all over Asia and the Pacific. I think all three speakers have clearly expressed all the challenges in both emergency response and in disaster risk reduction in terms of both planning and also good coordination among many different agencies and stakeholders who are involved. I'd like to ask a little question about training and preparedness, really. John, you mentioned about how important it was for AusAID to be coordinating with defence organisations that were very often the vehicles that delivered aid and emergency response. I'd like to ask about what further training and other programs are involved both with NGOs. For instance, Amalia, you might like to respond on what Plan International does in terms of training for professionals working in this field. Because clearly it's not just between government and defence organisations. There's many roles for both NGOs and for other agencies, including business organisations, which very often have distribution channels and methods of getting things out into the field, which other agencies don't have. So there are many different stakeholders that can bring their expertise and their attributes to play in this area. And I say this because Foundation for Development Cooperation does run workshops and training programs in this area, and the next one happens to be in Melbourne in the middle of May. But I'd like to hear from some of those others that have similar training programs. Thank you.
There's a lot of training going on. The ones that interest us are, you mentioned the militaries, the regional exercises that happen periodically. They're very important to engage in, for all players. And I think you're right. Your point about the private sector is right. So often the private sector are there weighing into a disaster, and if there'd been some sort of exercise that they could patch into in the country, I think a lot more would be known about their capabilities and utilised as well. Yeah, there's smaller and larger exercises happening all the time. It's a matter of how picking and choosing which ones we in particular engage in. But we're certainly going to be engaging strongly in the Asia Regional Forum exercise in Indonesia early in 2011, where 26 countries come together, the militaries of 26 countries, plus NGOs, plus donor apparatus, get together for a week and look at each other's systems and work out how best to respond to emergencies. We provide a lot of funding to Red Hour Australia. They provide a regular program of humanitarian training down in Dookie in Victoria, and a lot of NGOs take advantage of those programs to get their people trained up. We support UNHCR's e-centre training regionally, which is a very highly respected program of training that trains responders from around the region. There's 1 million of them. I think it is extremely important that we all engage as much as possible in these exercises and have people who are properly trained in our employ.
From an NGO perspective, just last month actually Plan Australia has conducted training in Ethiopia and Zimbabwe of our local staff. So one of our avenues for training is to train the local staff who will be on the front line of any response that Plan's involved in. And that was intensive training on emergency preparedness and response, which had a child protection component as well. We also have community level trainings. For example, after the Indian Ocean tsunami, a group of children were actually trained to do monitoring and evaluation at the community level to see whether the response had been equitable. So that was quite an interesting initiative. And as John mentioned, NGOs do take up those training opportunities. I've been involved in the training that Red Hour conducts in Dookie. I did the Child Protection and Emergencies one they've run. And some of my colleagues have just done last week, and I think next week are doing the Red Cross training that's being run in Melbourne at the moment. So there's a lot of learning going on, but the crucial thing for us is to get that to our country office colleagues.
How did it balance up? What did the children say in that case?
In Tamil Nadu, they said, I think the results were that, well, from the child's perspective, they were really enjoying that process of actually having the responsibility to do the monitoring. And the community was actually very appreciative of the children taking that role as well. And yeah, the findings were mixed, but overall were quite positive. But obviously in any emergency response there'll be gaps, and so the idea was to get the gaps highlighted so that they could be improved on. It took place, I think, about 18 months after the tsunami.
Look, thanks for coming today, everybody. This has been the Praxis discussion panel on natural disasters. Thanks everybody for coming. Good on you. Give yourselves a round of applause, hey?